Today, I want to tell you a folk tale that is very old, very dark, and particularly brutal in its nature. It's a folk tale you've probably never heard before, yet research shows it's at least 15,000 years old. And so, in this video, I want to explain where this story is told, why we think it's so old, and the variants that exist around the world. I'm John White, a specialist in Indo-European mythology, and before I tell you this tale, I want to warn you it is not for the squeamish. And so if you have a strong constitution and want to hear it, then grab yourself a good, strong cup of tea and welcome to Crackenford. Once upon a time, when we were east of the sun and west of the moon, there lived two women on a small farm. Each had children who played with each other, and one day, in need of food, the women went out of their farm to gather additional things, digging for roots, collecting plants, and searching for food in the wild. Side by side, the women looked very different. One woman was stronger and more predatory, and the other was gentler and never ate meat. And although they lived together, this relationship they had was really rather uneasy. There was a tension between them. One day, the stronger of the women suggested that they go out together to gather some additional food, and the other agreed and followed her to a remote location. And there, far away from their home, the strong woman treacherously killed the other woman, then cut up her body into pieces, her arms, her legs, her torso, her head, and brought the pieces back to the farm. And there she began to cook them in a large pot in the kitchen, as their children were still around. But as the flesh boiled in the pot, the children of the now dead woman glimpsed at it, and they recognised the limbs and the breasts in the pot. And they thought those body parts were speaking to them, warning them. And they recognised it was their mother's body. And the children between them worked out that their mother had been killed and was going to be eaten by this strong predatory woman. But for fear of their lives, they remained silent, but devised a plan of revenge. Later, they invited the children of the murderer to play a game of hide-and-seek in a cave near a river on a cliff. The game appeared fair, but the rules were not. In this cave, the children of the murdered woman had laid much dried grass beforehand. And so, when the game began, the murderer's children entered the cave willingly, trusting the game's rules, and they hid in the back of the cave under some of this grass. And there the murdered woman's children sought revenge, and they set the grass ablaze. Smoke and fire overcame the victims, and the children of the murderer screamed. But there was nothing they could do. The screams were so loud, so piercing, that the murderer heard them and went to see what was going on, and she saw smoke from the cave and the other women's children around. She ran to catch them, and the children tried to escape, climbing up the cliff, and the murderer followed, as she slipped and fell and landed in the water of the river beside the cliff and drowned. And there she floated off to disappear. The surviving children carried on running, never to return to the cave or the farm again. Now, at this point, most stories end with and they all lived happily ever after. But let's be honest, that's not the case here. This story ends with a map of its distribution, so you can understand where this story of a strong woman and a weak woman, sometimes a she-bear and a doe in some of the analogues, is told. This is not a single story I've told you. It is construction made from many of the versions found in this distribution you see. Now, whilst this story is quite brutal, which is how many folktales used to be, the interesting part of it is where it is found. We see it on the Pacific coast of America, in Indonesia, New Guinea, in Tibet, Siberia, and there is even one record of it in East Africa. Now, one of the reasons it hasn't been studied properly is because the story sits in a world, we would argue, between myth and folktale and animal tale. The main characters can be human, but there are stories where there are animals, with bears or deers, hares, rabbits, amongst other creatures. And to most, this may not seem like a significant issue, but the normal type of tale in First Nation Americans or these Eurasian tales is that the protagonists are not usually animals. They are humans with animal names and only occasionally take on animals' forms. And so these tales can easily be mistaken, if not read and understood correctly, to be a different type of story. And this is something that Yuri Berskin, the author of the paper The Doe and the She-Bear, a little-known folk story, talks about, and it's the paper I'm using as the basis of this video. The paper is referenced in the description below in case you want to do further research yourself. And to this end, the motifs that are part of this story can be found as part of the Berskin Analytical Catalogue under references J52 and J53, and includes their sub-references. And all these, because the Berskin database is in Russian, can be found in the Folklore database, which is a database that has been created with the support of YouTube members and patrons of this channel, the Crackenfold YouTube channel. And so I want to thank all of you who support my work. It is greatly appreciated by myself and the thousands of scholars and academics and students who use it to research. And if you'd like to press the like and subscribe button, it would really be appreciated and helps also to support this channel and this video, which is dedicated to people who like academic level research by a real person who writes and researches their own work without AI scripts. We are a rare breed, a bit like this story, and so all the support is appreciated. But to get back to Berskin's paper, the method he uses in his analysis is important because he's using data from this catalogue, a corpus of folklore studies, which compares thousands of motifs across over 1,000 traditions. And doing this can show a map of where narratives can be found and, importantly, not found. And the Folklore database will automatically map this data for you if you do try it. Now, one big problem with folklore is how do we date it? It is a challenge I get. Certainly many of the comments I get is, how do you know it's so old? Surely the oldest stories are from Africa, or the oldest story is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So to put things in perspective here, the oldest written story we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh, but humans were telling stories long before that. And this is part of the research we do to try and understand what they could be through the dispersal of stories. And people say because modern humans came from out of Africa around 55,000 years ago, surely Africa has the oldest stories. And I'd say that may be true, but we can't evidence it. The probability is that the stories we're looking at may not be that old. So that's really tough. So what we're doing here is using probabilistic maths to understand what is the most likely outcome by looking at the data. And the outcome of this story today is that it is, say, at least 15,000 years old, and I'll explain why as we go on. Now, to date a folktale is extremely challenging unless it contains something like a historical reference which we can align the story against, but even that can be made up later in the day, after the event. So what we do use in this field of studies is other data to help us have confidence. And this includes the use of genes to understand human migrations, linguistics to understand linguistic evolution and words used, and archaeology, along with migration routes. If you layer these together, you get a large corpus of very important data, because this is necessary to, in effect, respond to the challenges this brings. Because there are people who think what I do is overreach, and Erskine does. And we like to say that we do consider these things as part of our conclusions. So for us to understand an age of story, distribution is key, and the information, the data around it in terms of genes, migration, archaeology and the like is important. So let's look at where this story is found, and this will give us some understanding of this. So the first place to look is on Western North America, the Pacific coast. There are many recorded versions of the story here, and the versions here often use a grizzly bear as a woman and a smaller bear as the weaker woman. This is noted in the submotif J53C1. And the further south you go, there is much more emphasis on children's revenge through a fatal game using smoke or fire. And that story fits more with J53, which is the main motif, which has a doe as a victim. Now, these stories, especially those where the bears are protagonists, are significant in the First Nation American tribes and are used in ceremonies such as when bears are killed. And so the title of the folktale, The Doe and the She-Bear, is therefore partly literal in North America, depending on where the story is told. But another curious aspect of this tale is that the events take place with women going out gathering. They never farm despite living on a farm. And again, that may give us indication that the story may have started before farming was a thing. Now, if we go further south and look at Grand Chaco material from South America, we see a continuity of the story, but some transformation has occurred, and this is not unexpected with distance and time. In the Chamacoco and Mataco versions, the killer is no longer a bear but a jaguar, which fits the landscape, and the victim may be a wolf or a deer or a puma. And there's also one telling in the Chamacoco tradition where the principal characters are male rather than female. Yet the revenge remains structurally recognisable, with the victim's children still luring the killer's children into dry grass and burning them. And that is slightly different to the smoky house heat trap versions of North America, but it's close enough to support an argument that the regional variants are still part of the same larger story family, rather than unrelated tales that merely happen to talk of violence between families. Now, if we travel from here across the Pacific into eastern Indonesia and northwest New Guinea, we find evidence that prevents the story from looking like a purely sort of Siberian American story, which many of the stories, if you listen to this channel, talk about, because we can apply some dating to that. Now, Yuri Berskin has located versions of the narrative among groups in northern Halmahera and around Cenderawasih Bay, and here the protagonists are often more anthropomorphic than in the American version, whilst other details of the story remain very close to the American versions. For example, the murdered mother's breasts are recognised in the scene. Versions here also have the murderous mother parting ways with life at a water crossing, and all this happens whilst the narrative continues the motif of treachery and during gathering and not farming. So Berskin admits that this Indonesian cluster of motifs is a puzzling part of the distribution because it preserves strong parallels despite the large geographic gap between where you are in South America or North America and Siberia and Tibet, where this is also found, and where it is here in New Guinea. So we'll hold on to that for a second and look at some of these other places. So if you head north from here, we can find above India, we find ourselves in Tibet and the Salar of Qinghai, And here the narrative shifts a bit. The victim is usually a hare or a rabbit woman, which is motif J52 or, well, the submotif J52B. And the killer is most often a she-bear, which is J52A motifs. And the whole narrative leans towards the regional hare trickster tradition, but without actually being reduced to a trickster type motif. Now, in some versions, the victim's child kills the killer's child through a game or mock contest, which is aligned to the American tellings of the story. And over in Western Siberia, we see the narrative shift again, but here one woman kills another, but the child against child revenge is central to the motif we find in J52 is much rarer. Instead, we find that the surviving daughter moves into a broader Siberian pattern of a wandering heroine. So there's like an additional folktale bolted on. And even so, we still find the murdered woman opening and the bear and hare conflict, and similarities to the Indonesian traditions, which keeps the Western Siberian version of the narrative family inside this comparative framework. And finally, the other region the story is found is in East Africa. Now, we have to be really cautious here. The evidence to support this is weak at best, but it isn't so weak as to be irrelevant. And Yuri Berskin notes this in his paper, because in the Kalenjin text from Kenya, it is, well, the pattern of the narrative is really close to the American version. It's typologically similar, we would argue. But because the record is so thin, one narrative here, to have some strong historical reconstruction based on it would be flimsy at best. Now, the African occurrence is best treated, therefore, as a possible migration, not a probable one, a ghost motif, if you will. And so it suggests comparisons could be broadened, but it doesn't really permit a secure reconstruction of an African branch of the tale. And even though we understand migrations out of Africa, it still highlights that there is incomplete data in how this has happened. So for now, we can maybe put it to one side. But with all this, we can understand the narrative's dispersal. The question we then get asked is, where does it come from? How old is it? And this is where we need to be clear that there is a distinction between secure observation and speculative inference, which is that the secure observation is that this really is a coherent motif cluster in an unusual distribution, and so to date it from that is challenging. And Berskin notes this, and this approach should be considered speculative, because he then states his main argument is that the story entered North America and was first told in the Western stemmed tradition, which is often found west of the Rockies. And this conclusion he reaches because the range of stories' narrative, its dispersal, overlaps where we see evidence of Western stemmed tradition. Whereas Clovis culture, which is often considered as one of the first cultures, but it isn't the very first culture that was in America, and that's predominantly concentrated east of the Rockies. So being west of the Rockies, the Western stemmed tradition seems to be a better fit as where the narrative came in. Now, saying that the narrative was told by the Western stemmed tradition is speculative, but there is independent archaeological work that does support this, but there's also independent archaeological work that doesn't support that. Clovis is currently dated to around 13,050 to 12,750 years before present, and the Western stem tradition is dated to 13,000 to 11,000 years before present, and so slightly younger. But some have argued that it likely extends, that is the Western stemmed tradition, to 13,500 years before present, and part of the evidence for having that position is found within Paisley Caves, where Western stemmed points have been found in deposits contemporaneous with or earlier than Clovis, which gives some strength to Bereskin's argument that Western STEM tradition could be an earlier culture, and so gives him confidence to make that stand. Now, the next step is one I use a lot, and here Bereskin argues that too, is that if this motif and its sub-motifs, this story family, so to speak, was already established within the Western North American zone with the Western STEM tradition, then the narrative may have entered the Americas with very early settlers, which would imply a Eurasian origin of at least the age of the last glacial maximum, or the final years of the Paleolithic period. Now, for me, that hypothesis is plausible because archaeology has provided evidence for the case of an early Pacific coast migration into the Americas. But archaeologists will note themselves that this current evidence allows for multiple migration models of the people in America. And if you take this into account, what you can say is that the narrative is very old indeed. If it migrated around 15,000 years ago. But what migration path it took, we can't be absolutely sure. But certainly, considering that, I think Bereskin's hypothesis deserves some attention. It's not absolute. It is probabilistic. Stone tools and sites can be dated. Prehistoric folklore cannot. Not directly. So the point of this video is not only to show you how we can present a hypothesis for dating folklore in the Americas where it is told amongst First Nation traditions, but also to present you with a folktale you probably hadn't heard before, The Doe and the She-Bear. It's an interesting folktale, brutal, yes, horrific, and absolutely, but it is equally fascinating to the comparative mythologist because it's best understood as a deep family drama about predation disguised as companionship, about the exposure of hidden violence, about how children of the victim turn to cunning against children of the killer, or else they escape into a new future and a new narrative. Its specifics change depending on the landscape, and this is common amongst folk tales. Doe and bear, hare and bear, jaguar and deer, two women, or maybe even more abstract ancestral beings. But underneath that, its mythemes, its core concepts change far less than many skeptics would expect under such enormous distances and enormous timeframes. And it is that last part that is probably the key teaching of this channel. Now, I'm sometimes placed in the same realm as pseudo-archaeologists for this work, but I'm not making things up. The data is here for you all to see. The narratives, the distribution, it's in the folklore database. This is real data being used in real science. Now, whether or not this final Paleolithic dating is accepted by you or by other folklorists, only time will tell, and the comment section of this video. But it's probabilistic. To me, that dating is the most probable. There will be other answers I'm sure people will come up with, but are they as probable? If you have other answers and you want to comment them below, let me know, but provide evidence. People often say that isn't right, or people just make it up, but where's the evidence that says that is more probable than this dating where we see a historically significant distribution? What I think everyone should take away from this video, though, is that, and I think this is without significant challenge, is that folklore, powerful folklore, transmitted solely through oral tradition, can be conserved when we see it is, say, large distribution, almost irrespective of distance and time. And that means when we look at our folklore, this powerful folklore, we really are looking back into prehistory.